which is I'm going to do a meta talk. So I'm going to talk about a talk that I give. So, and in doing so, I'm going to go through that talk as if I was watching myself doing that talk. Does that make any sense whatsoever? You people study complexity. Anyway, so this is the book. This is a shameless plug, but in it, I'm using DNA as a historical source to describe in the first half how humans have evolved, how we are the way we are, how we got to now. And in the second half, it's much more an exploration of the history of genetics and the history of, to a certain degree, of the behavioral sciences. And I'm going to talk more about that and how we communicate ideas, these complex ideas about the relationship between human behavior and biology. And partly because one of the secret theses in this book is that I'm suggesting that we are effectively culturally programmed to misunderstand how genetics actually works. And it's, part of it is the history of the science, part of it is journalists, how it gets reported, but I also think there is a much deeper history, which is literally thousands of years old, about the way we talk about inheritance, and the way we talk about families, and the way we talk about family trees, which in the last few years, the post-genomic era, I think has turned out to be both, well, frequently wrong and always more complicated than was anticipated, and certainly more complicated than we sort of know how to talk about. So really what I do is about the conversation between scientists, particularly geneticists, and the public. Now, one of the things I sometimes say is that physics is easy, right? Everyone knows that. Physics is a reductionist science where you can simplify things at every juncture. Discovery attempts to make things simpler. In biology, we have exactly the opposite problem. All of the major transitions in biology in the last 200 years have drawn a picture which was more complex than anyone anticipated. So, now begins the meta talk. I would start with a sort of history of genetics, which would start with Mendel, but I don't think I need to do that with you. So I would go through the discovery of the concept of the gene through Mendel and his laws of inheritance, you will know that. And then we'll talk about the fly experiments in New York by Thomas Morgan in the 1920s, and then on to the discovery of the double helix by Cricket Watson using Franklin's data. And then the genetic code, and then we get to a point in the 80s where I show this slide. I presume you all know who that is. Woody Guthrie, right. Now, Woody Guthrie died of Huntington's disease. And the point of the narrative here, the point of, I like to use, I have a very visual presentation style. The point of showing Woody Guthrie and showing him talking about the fact that he had Huntington's disease was the sort of the origin of the modern story of genetics, where once we'd begun to suss the genetic code in the 1960s and 70s, Huntington's, cystic fibrosis, Duchenne muscular dystrophy were the first disease genes which were identified around about 1986, 1987. And this is also part of my suggested narrative that we fundamentally misunderstand how genetics works, because the reason those diseases and a few others were first identified, the genetic cause of them was first identified, is because they run through families in very clear Mendelian ways. They're passed from parent to child in a way which is predictable using very straightforward Mendelian patterns that are the same as how he described the wrinkliness of the peas and the colours of pea flowers. Okay? So this at this point in the history of genetics, we are seeing a pattern of inheritance which fits what we know about how biology works. Now, the history of genetics is such that more and more disease genes were being identified over the next few years until in the 1990s, largely prompted by the wealth of trusts, it was decided that this was not a productive way of going about understanding human traits, human behaviors, complex behaviors, and primarily diseases. And so the Human Genome Project was launched. Of course, this was a huge project, probably the biggest scientific project at that time. Large Hadron Collider concern is bigger now, but certainly the biggest endeavour within biology. So rather than going after individual genes, labs around the world would sequence the entire genome and create a database from which we could then mine our understanding of human variation, human diseases, human behavior. And it was, well, whatever the numbers, I can't remember now, it was 8 years, no, 13 years, $3 billion, which works out as $1 per base, and hundreds of labs. And then in 2001, the human genome was first published in Nature by a public consortium, private consortium led by Craig Venter. It was published in Science on the same day. And I was finishing off my PhD in genetics at the Institute of Child Health, just around the corner at that time. And some of you will either remember or be aware of when that happened, or actually before the publication, when it was announced that the first draft sequence was finished. There was an incredible media hoo-ha. Bill Clinton, who was president at the time, stood on stage with the two leaders, and Tony Blair was on the TV to represent the British input. And there were lots of pretty highfalutin things said. Today we will understand the language of God, which is a bold sensibility. It's also not quite correct, because we understood the language of DNA before that. This was more like going through God's really untidy filing cabinet. And then the news reports that followed, written by the BBC, there was, I have one example of a reporter describing how all diseases would be characterized within a couple of years, and most of them would be cured. Now, does anyone want to tell me the number of diseases that have been cured as a result of the Human Genome Project? Take a guess? It's none, right? It's none. And that isn't a criticism of the project. I think it was a great project. There's plenty of criticism that can be levelled at it. And these types of projects always deserve scrutiny. But that was not the point of it. Nevertheless, that was the narrative that was presented, at least from some quarters. I also think that sometimes big projects like that need grandstanding statements in the press. So partly to say, you funded this is a public endeavour, you funded this enormous project, and now we're attempting to bring you on board and say this is the justification for it. Now,